Hi, I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. In this video I'd like to talk to you about the new firmware upgrades for the Leica SL2-S and the Leica SL2. There's some exciting new features, particularly for the SL2-S in terms of shooting video in RAW. There's also some quite subtle adjustments to the camera that can be made in terms of customization, which are quite exciting, but it's not terribly obvious how you set them. So I'm going to explain exactly how that works. Let's get on with it. There's been quite a few changes in the new firmware upgrade on the SL2 and the SL2-S, so let's go through them one at a time and I'll explain how they work. The first one is the ability to customize the function of the rear thumb wheel and the top front wheel, as it's called. Previously, the camera's exposure mode determined what these wheels did, because they're not labeled in any sense, so they're not specific to one function. But now you can make them do exactly what you want, when you want, and in what mode you want. So it adds to the obviously extensive customization facilities in this camera. So let's just go into the menu, and it's page 4, and we want to go to wheel assignment for AF lenses. It's slightly different for manual focus lenses, but let's just concentrate on AF lenses for the moment. So go down to there, select that, and you get this little table here. Thumb wheel, this column, that's the thumb wheel. Front wheel, that's the wheel on the top. There's your exposure mode, program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual. Now I don't use program, so I'm not too bothered about the settings for that. I very rarely use shutter priority, but I do use it occasionally. What I'm looking for is some consistency. I like to have my main adjustment on the front wheel, for instance aperture, and I like to have my exposure compensation when I'm in some sort of auto mode on the thumb wheel at the back. So I can dial plus and minus exposure comp, I can set the aperture, and if I'm in aperture priority, of course, then the shutter speed is chosen for me. That means that if I come down on the back to A for aperture priority, thumb wheel, exposure compensation, front wheel aperture, and you change them simply by moving the wheel itself, the appropriate one. So I'm moving the thumb wheel, you'll see that one change. We've got ISO, aperture, and exposure compensation, and in the other one, it'll be exactly the same. You see? So I've got it on aperture here, and the thumb wheel is exposure compensation. I like to have the exposure compensation consistent so that I don't have to think about which way I want to operate the camera. That's why in manual mode, I've got aperture consistent on the top, and obviously there's no exposure compensation in manual mode, so the shutter speed becomes the thumb dial, or becomes controlled by the thumb dial as an equivalent. So you can set this up to your heart's content, whatever works for you, because muscle memory is very important when you're photographing and you don't want to be thinking about which dial does which. Now there is another section to this. If I just come out and go down to wheel assignment for manual focus lenses, and by manual focus I mean M series lenses and R series lenses that have been adapted to fit on the camera. Clearly you set the aperture on the lens, so there's no option here for setting the aperture on either of these dials. What you can do is set exposure compensation and ISO, something like that. Again, up to you. I try to be consistent, so I've got in aperture priority, I set the aperture on the lens, and my thumb wheel is exposure compensation once again. And in manual mode, my thumb wheel is shutter speed, just like it is on autofocus lenses, and because this wheel is therefore redundant, I might as well set it to ISO. Not really a big deal, I don't change the ISO that quickly the way I normally work, but still, it's nice to have it there. There is another customization you can make, which is to change the direction of the wheels. Now this is very much a matter of personal taste. You can have them going left to increase the value or left to decrease the value on both wheels. Personally, I've got my aperture, which is on the top dial, going up as I push it towards, well, the front is going towards my left, and it's coming down as I move it towards my right. And my exposure compensation here is going up to the right and down to the left. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. There's no good and bad here. It's just whatever way you choose to operate your camera. Keep it consistent so that you don't have to think about which direction you need to move the wheel to change that value up or down. So it's a really nice way to completely customize your camera to the way that your muscle memory works. Another new feature in the power settings in Leica Photos is the ability to not have the power shut down when you're using the wireless LAN, when you're working in the studio using some sort of wireless connected device like an iPhone. If I go into Photos, if I can find it, go in the wrong direction, there we go, Leica Photos on page 5. Wi-Fi sleep mode, never. Now you can change that to 5 minutes, tomorrow, or never. And if you set that on never, and the camera is not going to is set not to power down, the wireless LAN will remain active continuously. So if you're using the camera in the studio, firing remotely with a phone or something like that, you can feel confident that the wireless LAN won't shut itself down without you noticing. Nice little feature. And that leads me to another nice little feature, which is, as you can see here, I'm filming the back of the camera with this SL2 here using HDMI out. If I was using autofocus, and in this case I'm not because this camera is not moving around, but if I was using autofocus and I had the camera running on mains and I was using the HDMI feed to record, then I really don't want the autofocus to shut down, which it used to. But now, if I come out of the menus, I can go into camera settings, go into power saving, and if you'll see this line, second line down, auto off for autofocus. Now I've turned that off. So that means that with the camera on and not powering down, the autofocus will not shut down either. It will stay on permanently, which is ideal when you're doing demonstration videos or you're doing broadcast videos or webinars and so on. So a nice little addition to this new firmware. Another nice little function is the ability to reset the focus point to the center. So if you've found or lost your autofocus point, there is a way of recentering it, but it's not obvious how you do it because you won't find it in the normal menus. The key to this is to use the custom function buttons. There's one here on the left, there's two on the top, there's a rocker switch on the front of the camera, and you can even use the thumb dial on the top right here, which I have dedicated to exposure compensation. So I'm going to use the top right button on the very top plate of the camera, press and hold, and look, you get this menu which has loads and loads of options so you can customize the camera, one of which is toggle focus point. Now by having that set, so I'm clicking to select it, now if I move my focus point out of the way to this corner here, and then I click that top right hand button on the top plate, it will reset to the middle, which is extremely handy because it is very, very easy to lose that focus point. I have it on the top right hand button by my own choice. You may choose to have it here, but I do find that it fits nicely under my finger when I'm shooting and gripping the camera normally. So your mileage may vary, as they say. It's up to you how you customize the camera. The SL2-S and the SL2 have both had upgrades to the autofocus, particularly the eye focus. And the difference is that you can prioritize which eye you use to focus on. So you can see it working now. You should be able to see that the focus is tracking my eyes quite nicely. It's really locked on. And if I change to a different view, which is another camera filming the back of my SL2-S, you should see two little boxes on my eyes, one of which is yellow and one of which is white. Now if I was to turn my head slightly obliquely, this is the one that the camera is prioritizing, but it's slightly further away. So if you're shooting super narrow depth of field, you might find this one slightly soft. So you want this one focused. So what you do is you click the joystick on the back of the camera and it simply toggles the yellow from one side to the other. Piece of cake, really is. So with an oblique view like this, you might want to toggle that to this eye and then focus there. But on a straight on view like this, it doesn't really matter. I should also point out that when you have multiple heads in the view, and you'll see that yellow box around my head, you might see 3 or 4 yellow boxes, you might see 3 or 4 boxes on different people's heads, only one of which will be yellow. And if you've got 4 people in the shot and you only want to focus on one of them, you can use the joystick to move it left and right and move that yellow box from one white box to another to tell the camera which of those 4 choices it should make to lock the focus on. It's very intuitive and it falls under your thumb quite nicely as you're shooting. So some nice upgrades. That last one's been around for a while. The main one with this firmware is the ability to swap eye priority between the left and the right eyes. One other massive change for the Leica SL2-S, not the SL2, but the Leica SL2-S, which of course is more video oriented. And that's the ability to shoot in 12-bit ProRes RAW, which is effectively like shooting video in RAW like you do stills in RAW. Let me just show you where it is in the menus. So if you go into movie mode, and then you need to go into video format resolution, click that, and now you've got a third line. Previously we had MOV and MP4, now we've got RAW via HDMI. And what that's telling me is that you simply cannot record that sort of data volume internally onto an SD card. What you need is one of these. This is a Ninja, Atomos Ninja recorder. This is the Ninja V or Ninja 5. Fits on the top of the camera, and it's actually a little screen. That's a TV screen, so you've got the advantage of being able to have a much bigger viewfinder to work with. I can turn it on. I just click on the power button, which is, oh, there it is. I've got it running on batteries at the moment. It takes the standard Sony style batteries, so if you've got those for other video cameras, and you get this lovely little screen that sits on top of the camera. Sits there. It's super bright, super sharp, has all sorts of other functions like zebra stripes, focus peaking, false color. You'd connect it to the camera with HDMI cable, fits on a little adapter on top there, plug the HDMI adapter into the side of the camera, come like that. And you also need one of these, which is an SSD drive like you put in your computer or your laptop. You need to be careful which one you get, because not all of them work with the sort of data rate that we're talking about, but this fits into the back of the machine in a caddy like that, and then you're good to go. Now the thing is, this uses up a lot of data. Just to give you an example, it uses up somewhere around 6 gigabytes of data per minute, which is quite a lot. And if you're shooting at a higher frame rate, like 60 frames a second or something, you can double that again. So yeah, you're going to get through a lot of data, which is why you need an SSD drive. So you put a 1 TB or a 2 TB drive on that, and that's a lot more like it. You might even need a couple of those, but you certainly can't record internally. The advantages of 12-bit ProRes RAW are that you've got 12 bits of data, which is essentially what RAW files are when you're shooting in camera. But 12 bits is 4 times as much as 10-bit, and 10-bit was 4 times as much as 8-bit, which was your normal video recording internally. Now this camera will do 10-bit internally. This is 4 times as good again as that. So each pixel has a lot more data within that pixel and a lot more brightness. Not so much brightness range, it has the dynamic range of the sensor, but it has a lot more subtlety and gradation between the tones, so that in post, when you want to shoot in log and then grade it, log usually involves stretching out the shadows so that you're opening up the shadows, and you then can get this beautiful, beautiful smooth result, which is impossible to get, say, in 8-bit recording. If you try and do it in 8-bit recording, you'll find that the shadows go all choppy and horrible. 10-bit, it's really good. 12-bit is even better. So this is really aimed at professionals, but it's there in the SL2-S if you want it, but you will have to spend a bit more money on something like this. Something else that's been requested for quite a long time is the ability to preview depth of field, because the aperture is always fully open when you're metering and focusing and so on. But it's nice to be able to see just how much depth of field you've got and basically close that aperture down. So the way that works, again, it's not an option that's actually in the menus. You have to assign it to a custom button. In this particular case, I've assigned it to the front bottom of the rocker switch. So if I hold that down, this is the rocker switch on the front of the camera, holding it down now, long press, exposure DOF simulation, just below the toggle focus point, which we talked about before. So with that set, here is an M11 I've got, and you can see quite clearly how out of focus that keyboard is behind it. So the way you operate it is that you click the custom button that you've assigned the function to, and you toggle through depth of field plus exposure preview, and then back to nothing. So if I click it once, you'll see a little green blob turn up here with eye symbol, actually, if you look closely there. And it's now, can you just see how much sharper that keyboard has appeared? And then the next one will be exposure simulation, and it will get darker because I actually have the exposure set deliberately wrong so that you can see what the exposure will be, and you can see the histogram just drop back there. and there's the little I above an S, there's an I above an F, and then click it again, third click, and we're back to normal. So first click, depth of field, second click, exposure preview, and the third click, back to normal. Now, if you have the exposure preview set to PA and S, program aperture shutter priority, but not manual, this is how it will work. If, like me, you have it set to program aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, then that exposure preview won't actually do anything because you're already doing the exposure preview. So that it's just a little extra if you happen to be shooting in PAS mode like you're in the studio. I think you'll agree there's an awful lot to see in this new firmware upgrade. Who knows what they'll come up with in the next one. There's a few things that I could suggest. I'm sure there are plenty of other people out there who have ideas on what could be improved, but right now it's pretty good.